We are back for episode 5 of American Orthodoxy, and thank you for tuning in because today we are going to be going over a debate with Pinesap that I had a little over a year ago, and this one was highly anticipated by a lot of people. I actually have a clip that I'm going to post here in a moment, or I'm going to show you guys in a moment, where he kind of discussed it beforehand, and he had some things to say, so we'll see how that went for him. And then also, I wanted to, before we dive into the debate, I finally am monetized over here on YouTube. So I have memberships set up. So if you guys want to support me that way, some of the benefits for the memberships is I'll follow you back on social media. I'll help you out with whatever questions you have. I try to go through all my DMs, whether or not you're a subscriber or a paid member, but it's very difficult. So what I can do is I can give you guys priority if you're one of my YouTube members. And it's also just a way to support me. You also can gift memberships to people. And then the other thing is the super chats are finally set up. So glory to God, I finally don't have to go through Streamlabs, so you can finally send me super chats right here on YouTube, and I'll be able to go over them properly right here via the actual YouTube platform, and I'll be able to go over them at the end and bring them onto the screen. So with that being said, I want to show this clip of Pinesap, who goes by Feelsguy now, but this was back in his Pinesap days.
Next month, yeah.
Also, I made the screen bigger now, so, and I made myself smaller so that you guys, oh my goodness, thank you for the memberships. Awesome stuff. And feel free to, like I said, to gift members as well. So wow, we already got good start here for viewership. This is the best start. We hit 160 last stream. By the way, if you didn't tune in on Tuesday, make sure to go check out that episode. It's doing really well on the algorithm. And that's going to be my Tuesday and Saturday streams are going to be my sort of current events and going over history. It's going to be sort of my normal episodes, and then Thursdays are going to be my react stream. So I'm going to be reacting to various debates to bring all my prior content over here, and then also I want to react to other debates as well across the platform. So anyways, without further ado, here's this video from Pinesap right before our debate.
Gabriel asks, is it true you're debating on the Crucible next month? Yeah, I'm going to debate Luigi. That guy needs to be humbled, to be quite honest. I mean, he's literally got his butt beat by both RZ and Voice of Reason at this point, so this guy must be a sucker for punishment, but like, I'm not pulling any punches with this homie. He thinks it's cool to talk shit on the timeline about the church, about our faith and stuff like that. It's completely unacceptable. Like, most of the time I've been very, very cordial with people who I debate. I mean, the other Paul literally became like my best friend from us debating. Like, me and him, we're like glue now. We're real good friends and stuff like that as a result. But this guy's just such a shit talker. He honestly needs to be put in his fucking place. Like, I'm sick and tired of this guy running his mouth and blaspheming constantly on the timeline. And I'm not going to hold back. I'm going to rip into this blonde dork, quite frankly. This guy is just pathetic, and he's not even Orthodox. Do you guys realize that? Like, he's not even Eastern Orthodox. He's only a catechumen. And this homie thinks he's Mark of Ephesus, right?
So that's also not true. So at the time of our debate, like I said last time, I never once debated as a catechumen. I debated Voice of Reason as an inquirer. And then by the time that I debated Redeemed Zoomer and then Pinesap, I was baptized Orthodox Christian. So he doesn't know what he's talking about. At the time I was baptized, at the time of this video and at the time of our debate. But yeah, he had a lot to say going into the debate. So we'll see kind of how it went for him here in a moment. So thank you guys for the memberships. Thank you guys for the super chats. My goodness. We're going to have a lot to go over at the end. Glory to God. So thank you for that. I'm so glad I finally got monetized over here. I know it really sucked going over to Streamlabs. So, yeah, I don't think I have anything left to say. So these longer streams are going to be the debate review ones. This is a little over 2 hour debate, which means this stream will probably be about 3. I'm not going to stick around for the closing statements and questions this time because you guys can watch. Unlike the Voice of Reason debate, this one you guys can actually watch on the Crucible if you so desire. However, I do want to at least go over it and kind of bring some more viewership to this debate because in my personal opinion, I absolutely destroyed him. So, all that being said, you guys ready? You guys ready to dive in? Thank you for the memberships. Thank you for the memberships. And thank you for the super chats. Excellent. Excellent. And share the live. Please like the live. That's the most important thing. The monetization is a nice little perk, but the most important thing is getting the message out there. We want to get American Orthodoxy out there to the world. So please like the live. Please subscribe. And also, I do have a couple mods, but I'm looking for a few more. So if you're interested in being a mod for my show, please reach out to me. All right. That being said, let's dive in. So here we go.
12-minute openings on each side, followed by 5-minute rebuttals, 10-minute cross-examinations, and 30 minutes of open dialogue, and then we'll have closing statements and Q&A at the end. We did agree backstage that Pinesap will be going first, so Pinesap, whenever you're ready, you have 12 minutes on the clock. I'll start it. You said you wanted to share your screen. So yeah, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen, and then once I share my screen, I will let you know when I got my speech pulled up.
Yep. I'll start the clock when you share your screen. Yep.
Perfect. So do you see my screen now?
Yep.
Perfect. And then let me pull up my notes, and then I should be good to go.
All right. Clock starts now.
When our Lord promised to St. Peter the Apostle that he would pray so that his faith will not fail, Luke 22:32, that was a promise for a charis of infallibility which would be active after the church was bought with blood, Acts 20:28, so that his successors would protect the deposit of faith until the second coming. The point of this debate is to show that the doctrine of infallibility was known and existed in the first millennium church in a way which can be demonstrated with the utmost clarity. The patristic reasoning for this doctrine can be formalized as follows. Rome is the divinely instituted head, root, or font of the church, and the church is indefectible. Then papal infallibility is true. Rome is the divinely instituted head, root, or font of the church, or fount of the church. The church is indefectible. Therefore, papal infallibility is true. This should be pretty obvious. If we can demonstrate that the visible church cannot fail and it has a single principle of unity which defines whether you are in or out of the body, then that head, which is a necessary constituent of the body, cannot ever lead the entire church to error and cast off from the rest of the church. The first premise of this argument can be shown easily among the explicit reasoning of certain popes when it comes to their views on the divine institution of the papacy and their association with said office with the inability to err and its perpetuity. As early as 382, during a council held in Rome, Pope St. Damasus says the following and notes that the papacy is divinely instituted, it's set apart from the other churches by his office, and that the papal see is free from error in some sense. In the next century, St. Leo gives us a little bit more specificity that the Pope, in virtue of his divine office, can decree certain things due to his papal office, which we will later show is the ability to bind the whole church to a certain defined doctrine. Finally, we have the letter of Pope St. Agatho to Constantine IV, addressed to the Sixth Ecumenical Council, which gives a clear statement of the infallibility of the Pope based on the divine institution of the papacy. Now that we've established the fact that the divine institution is the basis by which the papacy stays immaculate in doctrine, and thus popes cannot be deposed on the basis of error, we move on to the notion of headship. In 1 Corinthians 11:3, we read that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of Christ is God. Very early on, the fathers viewed the church as having its ultimate head in Christ, and per each level of the church's hierarchy, a head which becomes the principle of unity for its body and its members. Ultimately, the episcopacy originates in and must be united to its head. Without its head, its members shrivel up and die. Many of these notions can be found as early as the 3rd or 4th centuries, and you can read them on the slide here. In all of these examples, we see that there is a unity of the episcopacy, which is undivided with its.
So a couple things that I forgot to mention. So this debate is very much a sequel to my Voice of Reason debate that I just reacted to last week. That's why I wanted to do it so shortly after. Yeah, Monkeys. Thank you for the super chats. And so it's a sequel to that debate, so it is kind of important to have watched that debate. And then also the intro opening statements are much shorter. I believe we only did 10-minute opening statements for this one, so I promise it's going to be a little bit. Once it gets pretty spicy, once we get into the actual open discussion, cross exam, and that comes a lot quicker because the Crucible doesn't like long opening statements. So don't worry, we will be getting to the exciting part soon here.
Principle of unity, or its ongoing foundation being its head, which it cannot do anything without. Now, you may object and say that these quotes do not show that there is a necessity to be in communion with Rome, but this is actually explicitly stated by St. Jerome when he says that the seed of Peter is the Ark of Noah and the solution to any schism. This position is further strengthened by the Formula of Hormisdas, a letter sent to all the archbishops of the East with the requirement to sign on to a formula defining the church as being made up of those in communion with Rome and not to ever concelebrate with anyone outside it. Finally, we have the perpetuity of the church, which Luigi and I both agree upon. Although I have some quotes up here, you can pause and read which exegete Matthew 16 as applying perpetuity to the papal office. Now that we have established the patristic reasoning behind papal infallibility, that there is a principle of unity which keeps the episcopacy unified and is indefectible and cannot teach error, we can demonstrate this happening in real time in history. In order to do this, we must define two ways by which the Pope can exercise his office as teacher and head of the universal church in which he is protected from error. Ex cathedra, where the Pope defines solemnly on faith or morals in his capacity as the teacher of all Christians, and via an ecumenical council, which requires papal ratification either before, during, or after a council. Luigi's task now, in order to defeat my position, is to contest that neither of these modes of teaching by the Pope have occurred in the first millennium. However, this task will be hard to uphold just by looking at 3 different councils and seeing whether or not certain criteria can be used to exclude robber councils and include other councils. It also needs to be noted that the Pope originally operated in an environment with an emperor not incentivized to work lockstep with the West. And as Status Cognitum shows, the church is like Christ, both divine and human. So the Pope always works with human means and is limited by certain human obstacles like temporal power. Due to a variety of reasons, in 430 AD, an official campaign to depose Nestorius began, and Cyril sent the 3rd letter to Nestorius and the 12 chapters against Nestorius, translated into Latin to Pope St. Celestine, who replied back telling Cyril that Nestorius had been cast out of the Universal Catholic Church and that Cyril was to be united to the holy head of the Blessed Apostle Peter. So already prior to the coming council the next year, the acceptance of the 12 chapters and the anathematization of Nestorius was ratified by the Pope. Pope St. Celestine wanted Cyril to finish the job. However, for those who believe that universal consent is the method by which we determine what council is ecumenical, you have a problem. When the first few people showed up to the council, Count Cadidian, the imperial representative who was supposed to start the council, was harassed by St. Cyril to start it before the arrival of Constantinople and Antioch. During this time, Nestorius refused to come to the church where the council was convened because he said Cyril was attempting to reside judgment over the council, which was unfair since he was also Nestorius's primary accuser. Also at this time, Ephesus was a stronghold for Theotokos respecters. And Nestorius's party in a letter described that they were stoned by lackeys disguised as monks and nearly killed. Now Cyril, after chasing Cadidian away, started the council, and without debate, him and 198 bishops remaining in the church voted to depose Nestorius. By the time John of Antioch came to Ephesus, he was furious that the council started without Antiochian representation or most of Constantinople present, and the later sessions condemned Cyril as a heretic. The confusion between the reports given by Cyril's party and John's party made it so that the emperor did not view anything as being accomplished at this council. To this day, according to canonical rules and the standards of Nicaea, Ephesus 431 is considered a robber council by the Church of the East because compared to Nicaea, it lacked a canonical imperial opening, free debate between parties, and unanimity and ecumenical representation. This is why papal ratification makes sense. Ephesus Session 1 was confirmed twice, once by Pope St. Celestine before the council, and a year after the council by Pope St. Sixtus III. So that view easily explains why the council is considered ecumenical. Yet, if we need universal consent or another council to interpret Ephesus and figure out what part of the council to accept, we need to actually go into the future to 449, where Ephesus Session 1 was accepted by the whole church in a general council you don't accept. And this council, for the most part, is about as canonical as Ephesus. We can debate this later, but the arguments for it not being a robber council that do not mention that it was struck down by a pope do not work. Ephesus too was called by an emperor and had a large representation of all parts of the church, and was called to depose certain bishops who were considered as Nestorians and tried to overturn Flavian's condemnation of the heretic Eutyches. By every metric outside Pope St. Leo striking it down as a robber synod, this council should be considered as ecumenical. In fact, after this event, Theodoret of Cyrus, one of the deposed, asked Leo to overturn the deposition and have Eutyches and Dioscorus deposed. He saw the Pope as authoritative over the council. All of this started due to a letter Leo wrote where he expected the entire church to accept it without a council, known as the Tome, which outlined the heresy of Eutyches. However, after many failed attempts at its implementation according to the intention of Pope St. Leo, as well as the
So I just caught this. He had Ephesus 499 on here, which I don't think that exists. He's talking about Ephesus 2, which occurred in 449, right before Chalcedon. So, and I went over a lot of this stuff in my Voice of Reason debate, a lot of these same arguments, because there was multiple local synods that had already addressed this. And then the notion that Ephesus was only ecumenical because it was accepted by the Pope is nonsense, because it had the universal consent of all the patriarchs except one. And so when you have the universal consent of all the patriarchs except for one, that means that that council has the authority to depose that other patriarch that is not accepting the council. And in that case, that see is either remains empty or it gets replaced, like in the case of Dioscorus at Chalcedon.
death of Flavian and Emperor Theodosius II, Leo, who did not want to call a council, finally allowed one to occur as convened under Emperor Marcian, so that Dioscorus could be condemned and deposed by the end of it, and every bishop would be forced to accept his tome. This council was essentially more extreme than other second millennia examples of papal authority, such as the trial of Martin Luther, as you can see on this slide. At the end of the day, this council, while accepted by all the popes, left a problem in the East. Non-Chalcedonians and Chalcedonians took turns hashing things out.
People are asking about my debate with Vor, so the original video is not available, which is why I reacted to the full debate last week, Thursday. So it's right here on my YouTube channel, on my YouTube Lives. You can go check that out. And thank you guys for the memberships. Thank you for continuing to send in the memberships. That's a huge point of support for me. And then appreciate the super chats. And please like and subscribe to live. Let's get it out there to the algorithm.
At some point, it got so bad that the East retracted Chalcedon, and it caused a schism for 35 years that was only accepted once the East signed onto the formula of Pope St. Hormisdas. Anyways, papal ratification clearly shows who was in the right, unlike reception theory, as David Earnhardt has conceded, was only clear 100 years after Chalcedon.
Here, I'll pause the clock while you get that video. I know you said you wanted to play something.
Oh, is the video not playing?
There's no audio coming through.
Oh my goodness, sorry about that. Can I thought I had set it to
here.
I believe you. I believe you.
No, that's fine. I do want to play that video though. It is very important. Oh, I guess I didn't click the. My goodness.
Yeah,
sorry.
just make sure it says share system audio.
It did.
Yeah. All right, try again.
Chalcedon in the church. There were Origenists in the church, so there were like different groups that were in the church at the time. That's why I'm saying it's difficult for me to argue that Chalcedon was epistemically speaking, that it was a council that we can say is 100% dogmatic. And about the Pope and the East, Pope versus East, that's kind of like I think this is kind of like something mentioned that Would you agree with me, Subdeacon Daniel, that we were part of the same church? We just didn't accept what council was the ecumenical one until the Jacobite schism. Will you say that we were part of the same church? Would you agree with that? And so, there was I'm making this point not to like make an objection, just to like inform the viewers. Like the schism happened over time. So many people think that, oh, Chalcedon happened, instant schism. Well, actually, no. It happened a century later. So there were Nestorianizers in the church. There were people that rejected Chalcedon in the church. There were Origenists in the church. So there were like different groups that were in the church at the time. That's why I'm saying it's difficult for me to argue that Chalcedon was epistemically speaking, that it was a council that we can say is 100% dogmatic. And about the Pope and the East, Pope versus East, that's kind of like, I think this is kind of like something mentioned that.
Okay, perfect. And that's it.
All right. Thank you for that. Thank you for that.
So he's just describing reception theory, and I point this out in our open dialogue, but they hold to reception theory too, because they will post hoc accept or reject parts of councils that prior popes had the opposite view on. They did this with Haec Sancta, with the Council of Constance, where they originally accept the entire council, and then a couple popes later, they say, oh, no, we don't accept Haec Sancta because it contradicts our paradigm. They did the same thing with Constantinople 879. Constantinople 879 was accepted by Pope John VIII. Now they accept Constantinople 869 instead. And that was done post hoc during the Gregorian reforms. So they accept. They're fine with reception theory. They're fine with reception theory. It's just that for some reason, when reception theory is the universal consent, then it's an issue. And yeah, here you see Ephesus 449. Maybe I misread earlier. I could have sworn he said Ephesus 499 earlier. In fact, I'm almost 100% sure he did. Maybe not. All right, let's dive into my opening statement here.
Opening statement, Pinesap, Luigi, whenever you're ready, you have 12 minutes on the clock for your opening statement. Okay.
Okay, I'm ready. Right. Today I will be arguing that the Church of the First Millennium held the ecclesiology that, 1,000 years later, is still held by the modern Eastern Orthodox Church. I recommend everyone watch my presentation during my debate with Voice of Reason, as I will be building on the content presented during that debate. There's only so much time I can cover in 12 minutes, so for this presentation, I will be going straight for the kill shots. First, I will be showing a case study of a universally binding decree that had only the participation of a single papal legate and mandated communion with several churches, none of which were Rome. Second, I will be demonstrating that while attempting to assert his apostolic authority over an ecumenical council, Pope Vigilius did indeed err on faith and morals. And finally, I will be showing that common papal honorifics, such as the title vicar, are applied to individuals other than the Pope, thus making all the common honorifics used by Roman Catholics a special pleading fallacy. The First Council of Constantinople was arguably the most important of the 7 ecumenical councils. It finally crushed the Arian controversy and produced the creed now recited across all of Christendom, minus the Filioque, of course. The only participation from Rome was St. Ascolius of Thessalonica. Otherwise, the council was fully driven by Eastern theologians, as was the case for all 6 of the other ecumenical councils. Following the council, Emperor St. Theodosius published the following universal decree, quote, "We command that all churches be forthwith delivered up to the bishops who confess the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost to be of one majesty and power, of the same glory and of one splendor, making no distinction by any profane division, but rather harmony by the assertion of the Trinity of the persons and the unity of the Godhead. To the bishops who are associated in communion with the bishop of the Church of Constantinople, and the bishop of the city of Alexandria, and the bishop of Laodicea, and Diodorus, and the bishop of Tarsus, the bishop of Iconium, the bishop of Antioch, the bishop of Caesarea, the bishop of Melitene, the bishop of Nyssa, the bishop of Cynthia, the bishop of Marcianopolis. Those who are of the communion and fellowship of these approved priests ought to be admitted to possess the Catholic churches, but all who dissent from the communion of the faith of those whom the special list has named ought to be expelled from the churches as manifest heretics." This is found in the Theodosian Code. So in short, Emperor St. Theodosius
published a decree that bound the entire Catholic Church to a particular doctrine, mandated communion with Antioch, Alexandria, and Constantinople, and failed to even mention Rome. It was this same council that in Canon 3, Constantinople is crowned the title New Rome.
So do you guys get the significance of what I just read out? So this is the decree following the First Council of Constantinople, and Emperor St. Theodosius, who is the emperor that's responsible for making Christianity the official state religion of the empire, he is releasing this decree following this council, demanding that everyone submit to the council and to particular churches such as the church in Nyssa, all the churches listed. He says you have to be in communion with those churches and with their dogma of the Trinity in order to be a Catholic church. That's what the decree after the council states. And Rome isn't even mentioned. If this decree, and I point this out, if this decree had been done by any pope, we would never hear the end of it. We would never hear the end of it. But because it was an emperor, most of you probably don't even know about it. Most of you that are engaged in a lot of these debates about the papacy probably aren't even aware of this document. And yet, it's a dogmatized decree following the Second Ecumenical Council, where Rome had a very, very, very low level of involvement.
And Flavian was appointed as the Bishop of Antioch against the wishes of the Pope. In fact, from the year 394 to 399, almost every church, including some Western churches, was in communion with Flavian, while Rome was out of communion with him. It wasn't until 399 when Rome, as usual, submitted to the rest of the church. Theodoret states in Church History, Book 5, Chapter 23, quote, "The Western bishops promised to bring their hostility to a close," end quote. The idea that communion with Rome is absolutely necessary to be a Catholic church is utterly ahistorical. So in this singular case study, we see that the universally binding decrees can be published with little papal involvement. Communion with Orthodox doctrine is far more important than communion with Rome. And when Rome is up against the consent of the church, they ultimately submit. Now I will demonstrate that while attempting to bind the whole church at the Fifth Ecumenical Council, Pope Vigilius taught a doctrinal error, meaning he did not err only on matters of fact, but also on faith and morals. So that there is no question that he was attempting to bind the church via his authority as the Apostolic See, I will read the end of his first constitutum written to the council. Quote, "We ordain and decree that it be permitted to no one to write or bring forward anything contradictory to the contents of this constitutum, or after this declaration, bring a new controversy about them. And if anything has already been done in contradiction of this our ordinance, we declare void by the authority of the Apostolic See," end quote. Pope Vigilius concludes his letter by asserting his ultimate authority as the Apostolic See. He says that following this letter, there is to be no new controversy regarding the 3 chapters or the letter to Maurice from Ibas. It is the final declaration to which no one should question, by the authority of the Apostolic See. Not only are Vigilius's lofty claims rejected by the council, but he is excommunicated until he finally repents 2 years later when he releases his second constitutum that retracts the first. In fact, the council states, quote, "We have pronounced that his name is alien to Christians," end quote. But what were the contents of this first constitutum in which Vigilius attempted to bind the church with? He defends a heretical letter from Ibas to Maurice. Yes, not only did he defend the person of Ibas, he defends the contents of the letter. About the letter, he states, quote, "From the reading of the text of the letter produced by his adversary, his writing has been shown to be Catholic," end quote. And again, quote, "We decree and ordain with the authority of our present verdict that, as regards all matters, and in particular the oft-cited letter of the venerable Ibas, the judgment of the fathers in session at Chalcedon is to remain inviolate," end quote. Now, Vigilius erroneously thought Ibas's letter to Maurice was accepted by the Council of Chalcedon, when in fact the council actually accepted Ibas's letter from the clergy of Edessa. This is an error he corrects in his second constitutum, when he acknowledges the letter to Maurice is Nestorian. In fact, he blames the devil for deceiving him. Quote, Vigilius writes to Eutychius, Patriarch of Constantinople, blames the enemy of the human race for deceiving him into writing against the 3 chapters, and then annulled the first constitution by the authority of our present letter, end quote. This is in Price's Acts of Constantinople, pages 110 through 111, and the defense of Ebas's letter is found on pages 199 through 205. There is simply no way to nuance around this. Vigilius attempted to bind the church to a doctrinal error and then blames the devil for it before ultimately submitting to the council's decrees. This single-handedly falsifies the Vatican I papacy. Finally, I want to show how common papal honorifics used to justify Vatican I in the first millennium are simply special pleading. They could just as easily be used to justify the emperor and even other patriarchal sees as having Vatican I level power and honor. The Pope calls the emperor Christ's vicar of the world. Quote, "Your clemency is the sanctuary of the public, so that through your insistence, God has ordered you to govern the world as his vicar." End quote. It's Pope Anastasius II, Epistle 1, letter to the emperor. Pope Agatho applies Matthew 16 to the Orthodox Empire of Constantinople during the Sixth Ecumenical Council. Quote, "And with the Almighty who rules you, O most devout emperor, you decide because you are appointed by God. Rejoice, O city of Zion, summit of the world and empire. Constantine ornamented you with purple and crowned you with faith, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against your Orthodox empire." End quote. Papal Primacy, page 50. The emperor elsewhere is called the divine and inviolable head on page 308 of Price's work on the Third Ecumenical Council. Writing to the Pope, the Sixth Ecumenical Council says, quote, "For these decrees, the Holy Spirit by his grace dictated to the tongue of the imperial pen," end quote. Gregory II calls Pope Leo III the, quote, "king and head of Christians," end quote. Pope Adrian even says in letter 8 that he and his synod are the spiritual children of Charlemagne. How about other patriarchal sees? Let's start with the term apostolic see. This was not an exclusive title. During the Council of Ephesus, in its July 16th session, St. Juvenal of Jerusalem calls his own patriarchate an apostolic see. Eastern patriarchates were also in passing called apostolic sees during Nicaea too. Additionally, both Justin the Emperor, who enforced the formula of Hormisdas, and St. Augustine say that being in communion with Jerusalem is absolutely necessary to be a Catholic church, and no one would dare break communion with them. Justin says to Pope Hormisdas, while demanding he compromises on the formula for Hormisdas, quote, "Unite everywhere the venerable churches, and especially the Church of Jerusalem, on which all bestow their goodwill, as being the mother of the Christian name, so that no one dares to separate himself from that church," end quote. Of note, Hormisdas complies with the emperor. St. Augustine, by the same token.
So that's a very important point, because he brought up the formula of Hormisdas. And this is, for those of you that are engaging in these debates with Roman Catholics, they like to bring up the formula. They think the formula was actually something, because the Pope attempted to submit this decree that would have been universally binding, and it was basically rejected or edited by the entire church. And finally, the Pope ends up submitting to the emperor and to the Patriarch of Jerusalem, who demanded that it would be edited. And so because of the authority of Jerusalem, they end up submitting to it. And here, I'm going to retweet this post for you guys, and I'm also going to put it in the chat, because this is my thread on regarding the sort of quote mines that they like to use for popes. Basically, I offer a quote for like every single one of the quote mines that they offer. So this is the one I just read live there. This is the one where Pope Leo says that the emperor can't even err, which is significant. Like, this is the type of stuff that they try to use against us, and it's just special pleading, because they'll show this quote. Oh, the Pope. This quote says the Pope can never fall away, can never fall into error. Well, here's the Pope literally saying the same thing about the emperor. So, and that's clearly an honorific. This is where the emperor is literally called the vicar, God's vicar, which is, I mean, you guys know that is a title that is the Pope tries to claim, which doesn't show up till much later in church history. So this thread is full of plenty of quotes for you guys that show that all these papal apologetics are actually just special pleading. I mean, some of these are just insane. This is where St. Basil calls Antioch the head of the church. in multiple occasions here, saying that Antioch, there is no church more vital than Antioch. St. John Chrysostom, this one's crazy. Moreover, God himself had great care for this city, as indeed he manifested by the very deeds which he did. At all events, the master of the whole world, Peter, to whose hands he committed the keys of heaven, whom he commanded to do and to bear all, he commanded to spend a long time here. Thus, in his sight, our city, Antioch, was equivalent to the whole world. But since I have mentioned Peter, I perceived a fifth crown woven from him, that this is the man who succeeded Peter in power. So, look at this. So, Antioch, equivalent to the whole world. This is the type of stuff that they like to reference for Rome. And here it's being said about Antioch, succeeding Peter in power. Succeeding Peter in power. That's significant. And then, secondly, I want to show you guys. So, the book that you guys have to get, if you're interested in this topic and you want to refute you want to refute Roman Catholics, The Rise and Fall of the Papacy is a must read. This book, in fact, this book covered a lot of my content that I went over in this debate. All right, I'm gonna keep going here. But if you guys are really interested in diving deep into this topic, you can check out that book.
Quote, if you be Catholic churches, communicate with that church from which the gospel is spread abroad over the whole earth. Communicate with Jerusalem. Christ made there the beginning of the preaching of his name, and you shrink back with horror from having communion with that city. No marvel that being cut off, you hate the root. Homily 2 on the first epistle of John. St. Clement even calls Jerusalem the bishop of bishops. While on the topic of St. Augustine, he also states that decisions made by Rome are not final and can always be reversed by an ecumenical council. Quote, well, let us suppose that those bishops who decided the case at Rome were not good judges. There still remains a plenary council of the universal church, in which these judges themselves might be put on their defense, so that if they were convicted of mistake, their decisions might be reversed. End quote. St. Augustine, letter 43, paragraph 19. So much for Rome has spoken, the case is closed. What about the authority of Peter? Not only is the patristic consensus that every bishop is Peter, listen to this quote about...
So I read that quote last stream, but do you understand the significance of St. Augustine saying that if Rome is wrong about a decision, bishops can appeal to the plenary council? So he's saying, St. Augustine, the champion of Western theology, supposedly, and Western ecclesiology, is saying that a plenary council of the universal church is above Rome's decision. Do you understand the significance of that? And I can show you where this actual quote is found so that you guys have it. One moment.
Antioch from St. John Chrysostom. Quote, moreover, God himself had great care for Antioch. At all events, the master of the whole church, Peter, to whose hands he committed the keys of heaven, whom he commanded to do and bear all. He commanded to spend a long time here. Thus, in his sight, Antioch was equivalent to the whole world. But since I have mentioned Peter, I have perceived a fifth crown woven from him. And that is this man, Ignatius of Antioch, who succeeded Peter in power, end quote. Additionally, St. Basil calls Antioch the head of all churches in letter 67. Universal titles such as ecumenical patriarch are used to refer to both Constantinople and Alexandria throughout church history. Finally, one of the most crushing quotes of all is from the Roman Catholic's very own Eighth Ecumenical Council. Quote, for where will you seek refuge, or where will you go? God established his...
So here are several quotes by champions of the Latin faith, supposedly. This is the one that I just read that states that if Rome makes a error on their decision, that you can appeal to the higher authority of a plenary council. Here is St. Jerome saying that the world outweighs its capital, meaning that if you have the consent of the church up against Rome, then you would side with the consent of the church over Rome. This is St. Vincent de Lerins talking about the given the same rule as the Fifth Ecumenical Council. So I read this last week regarding the Constantinople II, and he is reflecting on another ecumenical council, and he says the only way that these issues can be solved is via universal consent, the consent of all. And then here is Pope St. Martin that I went over last week and this week, explicitly saying that he doesn't have the authority to appoint a patriarch unilaterally. And here is the link to that in the chat. Thank you for the super chat. And thank you for the memberships, guys. So I finally have memberships. So if you want to support me monthly, you can sign up for memberships. And then if you want to send in a super chat, I'll be going over all those at the end. Also, please like and subscribe to the live and to my channel. All right, let's keep going.
His church in the 5 patriarchates and decreed in his gospels that they would never at any time totally fall away, since they are the heads of the church. For the saying, and the gates of the underworld will not prevail against it, has this meaning: if 2 were to fall away, people are to have recourse to 3, and if 3 fall away, they are to have recourse to 2. While if it so happened that 4 were to fall away, the single one remaining in the head of all, Christ our God, would call back again the remnant of the body of the church. This quote is so damning to the Roman Catholic position because it applies Matthew 16 to all 5 patriarchs, says they will never fall away, and then goes on to say that if 4 fall away, the one that is upholding orthodoxy would become the head, and Christ would call back the 4 patriarchs. Notice it doesn't pick out Rome. The quote implies any of the 5 sees could become the head of the church in the scenario of mass apostasy. To conclude, we see from Constantinople I that universal decrees can be executed without a mention of the Pope, and that communion with orthodoxy is far more important than communion with Rome, despite Unum Sanctum and Vatican I stating communion with Rome is absolutely necessary. We see from the case study of Pope Vigilius that he erred on a matter of faith and morals while attempting to bind the universal church, thus violating Vatican I papal indefectibility. And finally, we see from the honorifics applied to the emperor and other patriarchs that common Vatican I proof texts are a simple case of special pleading. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that opening statement, Luigi. It went about 20 or 30 seconds over, so
my
it's
fault.
okay. If you
that's
guys are okay. Okay.
Well,
I was gonna...
to be fair to Luigi, the video that I played kind of went long, so he can have that time back.
Yeah.
That's totally fine.
Okay. All right, so we're going to get into rebuttal segments. So each of you will get 5 minutes, starting with Pinesap, and then we'll go to cross-exam. So Pinesap, whenever you're ready, you have 5 minutes on the clock for your rebuttal.
Awesome. Are you good now?
Yeah, yep, go ahead.
Awesome. So it's kind of interesting that Luigi brought up Constantinople I in sort of affirming that the synod happened without Rome, because from anywhere that I can recall in church history, it was never declared that Rome.
So you can see me shaking my head because that's not what I said. And Craig Trulia does a good job of arguing that Rome actually did have proper representation at Constantinople I. Even if they didn't, we hold the reception theory, so, we can accept it post hoc, and that's not an issue for our paradigm. So the fact that he would say that, because that's not what I said that Rome had little involvement. That's what I said. Little involvement, not no involvement.
Had a different faith from not initially approving the council. And in fact, Luigi's own John II of Kiev, who wrote a letter to Pope Clement at the time, I think it was Clement IV, shortly kind of after the 1054 schism, actually remarks how the popes from the First Ecumenical Council to the Seventh Ecumenical Council confirmed these separate councils. This is actually in the Orthodox Patristic Witness Against Catholicism, in which he's writing this letter and saying that it is the Pope of Rome who ultimately confirms these councils, similar to that of St. Nicephorus, St. Theodore the Studite, and St. Stephen the Younger around the time of Nicaea too. Now, it's also curious that he brings up the Theodosian Code, because the same
So saying that Rome needs to accept a council is not a problem for our paradigm, because if Rome has a proper pope, a pope that is not in heresy, where the see is actually being filled by a real patriarch, just like every other patriarch, yes, he has to ratify it for it to be ecumenical. This has always been our paradigm. So saying, oh, St. Theodore the Studite or Nicaea II says that Rome has to ratify it. Yeah, it also says every other patriarch has to ratify it. That's what St. Theodore the Studite says. That's what Nicaea II says. I'll show you guys those quotes. So just because Rome has to ratify it, that's not a problem for our paradigm. As long as Rome is filled by a legitimate pope who's not in heresy, like ends up happening in the 11th century when they fall away, that's really, if I could really boil down for you guys, what is this debate? It's really over whether or not Rome can fall away. That's really what it comes down to. It's that, and then it's, do ecumenical councils supersede the Pope? Those are like the two things. Those are the two things.
Theodosian Code that had outlined the quote that he had given us also lays out that all the churches of God should have the same faith as Rome and Alexandria. Alexandria had a very Orthodox succession up until that point that the code was written, and was known for having great, saints who had proclaimed Orthodoxy. But what's curious about that is later statements after the code comes out only affirms that Rome has the unerring faith, as later on Alexandria would of course fall away from the faith. Let me see if I can get to the Meletian Schism if we have time, but I want to skip that for a moment. Going on to Vigilius, Vigilius actually gives a partial condemnation of the contents of the 3 chapters. St. Cyril, and part of the reason why, not in his final decree of the First Constitutum, but kind of the commentary surrounding it, he doesn't condemn the authors by name, is because they had been reconciled at Chalcedon. He had thought that they were in perfectly good standing and peace with the church. So at most, he got a matter of fact wrong, something that is not protected by the charism of papal infallibility. When he goes on to say that he had been deceived by the devil, it is not an admission of heresy, but it is rather that the devil created discord between brothers of the same faith. That is why in that same quote, he says that the council fathers of Constantinople II and himself had always shared the same faith, and that the devil had merely caused confusion in the sort of heat up that had occurred up and leading to.
So that's not true. I'm going to find that quote as well. But here is St. Theodore the Studite talking about exegeting Matthew 16. And look what he says. He says, who are their successors? Who are the apostles and their successors? Which is what he's saying Matthew 16:18 is about. Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. The Pentarchic authority. That is who, and this is Ubi's article that I'll put in the chat for you guys. That is who he's saying succeeds the keys of Matthew chapter 16. So I don't know why he's citing St. Theodore the Studite in this context.
The Second Council of Constantinople. Finally, the excommunication, as we all know, was struck from the 8th session of the council, and that was the session that Pope Vigilius actually had accepted, right? His excommunication completely struck out. Needless to say, Justinian also was a complete bully during this council. He deposed any patriarch that would not agree with them and any bishop that would not agree with them. And this is why St. Menas of Constantinople actually goes to Vigilius and apologizes to him for his conduct, because essentially Justinian had forced his hand to issue this condemnation. That hardly a conciliar action as far as I'm concerned. Now, context is what makes the claims, not mere honorifics or words, right? A bishop can.
So here's the citation where you guys can see both the excommunication that's found in Price's work, as well as, I'm putting this in the chat, as well as Vigilius blaming the enemy of the human race for deceiving him. You can read the full quote here in this citation. And then he annuls the first. So how can it be the same faith when the first, he's obviously saying that to try to win back over his brothers, who he had just ostracized, and he had attempted to assert his dominant authority and then got humbled. That's clearly what's happening by him saying that they had the same faith. But how can they possibly have the same faith when he is annulling the first constitution that literally had a affirmation of a letter that he now considers, that he now understands that he misunderstood at Chalcedon, a letter that contained theology, faith, and morals, like I laid out in my opening statement. This was a error on faith and morals. And then he has the audacity to talk shit about Emperor Saint Justinian, who in Pope Agatho's letter explicitly states that he is to be venerated by all nations. And I showed you guys this in the Voice of Reason debate. I'll show it to you again. So all these people that talk shit about St. Justinian don't realize that Pope Agatho, in the letter that they consider to be ex cathedra, literally says he should be venerated by all nations, that he's that holy of a saint. That's the guy that they're talking shit about right now.
Can be referred to as a head, or another apostolic see can be referred to, as the apostolic see, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that is the see that presides over the whole church. It's the context of what the letter is speaking about that actually makes it. And in fact, actually post-schism, we acknowledge that there are other Petrine sees established by Peter, but, Rome is, of course, given the presidency or presiding over the entire church. You only need to see the, primary sources around the crusading times of Pope Innocent III referring to Alexandria and Antioch as Petrine sees. This is one of the most ultramontanistic popes that would have.
Yeah, he's presupposing the ultramontanism. Here, I'm going to pull up this quote of Emperor St. Justinian here. So right here, literally says, talking about Emperor Justinian, this is Constantinople III. This is the letter of Pope St. Agatho. And he literally says that he is worthy of veneration by all nations. Right here. So this is the guy that Pinesap is over here throwing under the bus. And I'll throw this into the chat.
Have lived during the medieval era. Likewise, how much more time do I have?
1 minute.
Okay. Likewise, with Zion, in reference to the Sixth Ecumenical Council, referring to sort of the Orthodox Empire never erring, Zion is a biblical and patristic reference to the church that comes from Hebrews 12:22. And what that acclamation is saying is that so long as the Orthodox Empire holds the Orthodox faith, the gates of hell will never prevail. But it's still centered on the church. This is why during that acclamation, it comes up that the emperor has put on the invincible shield of faith, right? If I'm paraphrasing the statement, right? So as long as the Orthodox Empire conforms to the Orthodox faith, of course, the gates of hell will never prevail against it. And do I have time there?
You have about 10 seconds if you want to say
okay.
So what's funny about what he just said is that's our view of the papacy. So exactly what he just said about the emperor, and he would say it also about every other patriarch, that the gates of hell will not prevail against the orthodoxy of that see or that imperial seat. That's what he just said. That's our view for everybody, including the Pope. So the difference is he makes an exception, he special pleads for just the Pope. Whereas we say, no, that's true for everybody. That's true for the patriarchs, that's true for the emperor, and it's true for the Pope. That the gates of hell will not prevail against him insofar as he maintains Orthodox doctrine. That's what he just said. He just conceded that. He just makes the exception for the Pope. He special pleads for the Pope.
I'll concede my time there.
All right. And Luigi, you've got 5 minutes for your rebuttal. Whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Okay, I'm gonna try to get to as much as I can here. So first, I want to start with the formula for mistas. I mean, I don't know why this is ever used as a papal like proof text. It's actually really embarrassing for the Pope. Patriarch John II of Constantinople edits it, and he says, "I accept the fact that the two most holy churches, that is to say, that of ancient Rome and that of New Rome, should be one see. I admit the see of Peter and that of the imperial city should be one." Now, what Roman Catholics try to say is that this is just him talking about them being in communion together. Except the papal legate Dioscorus writes an apology to the Pope that, quote, John II tried to make it out to be a letter rather than a libellus, and appropriate for a libellus to allow the aforementioned signature. So if this was just, oh, yeah, it's just Rome and Constantinople are in communion together, if that's all he was saying by saying they're one see, then why is the papal legate apologizing to the Pope for allowing that signature? Additionally, immediately after the form of Hormistas, actually, one more point on the form of Hormistas. As I said in my opening statement, the Emperor Justin was actually the one who drove the signatures, and he required of Hormistas that it would be edited. And Hormistas accepts those edits. He says, been set up from the hearts of the apostles, Peter and Paul themselves, in these apostles, the banner of faith. So he accepts the edit where Paul is included in the Hormistas, where initially it was just Peter. And as I read earlier, Justin demanded this be the case in order to include Jerusalem because communion with Jerusalem was considered to be absolutely necessary to be a Catholic church. Additionally, immediately after the formula was finally signed, the Theopascite formula, a lot of the same bishops that signed it, they rejected Hormistas's view on the Theopascite formula. So this is clearly not some sort of papal proof text. Again, it was actually very embarrassing for the Pope. I talked about headship. I mean, like just the fact that there's quotes that call Rome the head. I mean, there's a sense in which, of course, they were the first see. All the patriarchs are called heads. The emperor is called head probably more times than the Pope is. So again, that's not a Vatican I proof text. As far as the Council of Ephesus, I want to read St. Cyril. He brought up St. Cyril. Constantly says that Celestine is the head of the Western churches. And he says this, this Price, page 159. The Holy Council of Rome issued a decree excommunicating Nestorius and indeed wrote to your piety, Patriarch John of Antioch. The instructions that must be followed by those who wish to remain in communion with all the West, for we ourselves, Alexandria Synod, shall follow his judgment, fearing to lose the communion of so many. So he was concerned about losing the communion of the West. That was his concern. In fact, when there was a papal honorific read at the Council of Ephesus, St. Cyril immediately replies. He says, they, the Roman legates, have pronounced as representatives of the Apostolic See and of the entire Holy College of the most beloved and most holy bishops of the West. They have given their assent to the verdict against the heretic Nestorius. So it's clear that St. Cyril saw the Roman legates as representing the West. As far as the actual like conciliar and synodal nature of Ephesus and having the consent of all, I mean, this is St. Vincent de Lorenz on how Ephesus was authoritatively interpreted. Quote, that by their consentient determination, the reverence due to ancient truth might be duly and solemnly confirmed. We recorded the names and the number of the fathers, according to whose consentient and unanimous judgment, both the sacred and preliminaries of judicial.
So I particularly want you guys to have the receipts on the stuff that I just went over with the formula of Hormistas. And I just put this link in the chat. And then for those of you that are watching back the stream, you can see it's right here on my Twitter, and it's right in the comments of this live stream. So there's a couple things. I mean, there's the papal legate, effectively apologizing to Hormistas. This is what I said about the Theopascite formula, where many of the bishops who had accepted the formula because of its orthodoxy then reject the Theopascite formula, which is being driven by Rome likewise. So it's clearly the orthodoxy of the formula of Hormistas that they were accepting, and not just the nature of it coming from Rome. Here is where Emperor Justin discusses establishing recommunion between Constantinople and Rome and how important it is. And then this is Rome and Old Rome and New Rome becoming one see. which is significant. And then this is the most important one here, where it says communion with Jerusalem is necessary because it is the mother of the Christian name. I mean, listen to this. So Justin cautioned Hormisdas that coercion was not working. So the Pope is trying to coerce, and the emperor literally says that he must unite everywhere the venerable churches, and especially the Church of Jerusalem, on which all bestow their goodwill, as being the mother of the Christian name. So he's saying because Jerusalem is the mother church, it must be that everybody is communion with them. Everybody is in communion with them. It must be the case. And then this is where Hormisdas ends up accepting edits. So yeah. And then the significance of the apology to Hormisdas earlier is that he basically is apologizing because he allowed the concession, he allowed the edit of Rome and Constantinople being one see. So that has to do with this right here. So I want you guys to have the notes for this, because this is a very common, we don't want Hulu edit ads here. This is a very common thing that a lot of people will attack.
Procedure were expounded and the rule of divine truth established. So what St. Vincent is saying here is exactly what the Fifth Ecumenical Council ends up saying, that the only way to establish divine truth is in the context of an ecumenical council with unanimous judgment. So if Pinesap is going to contest this, he's going to have to say that St. Vincent is wrong, St. Theodosius before the council is wrong, St. Cyril is wrong, because they all say over and over and over again, the reason why it's authoritative is because it has the consent of all. This is really interesting at as far as what he said on Chalcedon. This is Pope Leo on the excommunication of Dioscorus. Therein, Leo refers to Dioscorus as the bishop of the city of Alexandria, but does not identify Eutyches by his clergyman title because he had been lawfully condemned by his own bishop. So because Dioscorus was not excommunicated by the ecumenical council, Leo still gives him his title of bishop of Alexandria, whereas he doesn't do the same for Eutyches because he was actually excommunicated by his own patriarch. And I think that's my time.
All right, thank you for that rebuttal, Luigi. All right, so gentlemen, we're going to get into the cross-examination segment. Each of you will get 10 minutes. For those that are not familiar with how that works.
Also, all my notes, if you subscribe to me on Twitter, or if you sign up for memberships here on YouTube, or if you sign up for my Substack, if you're any one of my paid monthly subscribers, then I will send you my notes for any debate that you want. So if you're one of my paid subscribers, that's one of the benefits I'll give you is I'll send you whatever notes you want from any of my debates.
One side will get to ask questions. The other side will only be able to answer questions. The only questions you can ask would be a clarifier about the question. If you have a counter question, you need to wait until your cross-examination segment. We're going to start with Pinesap. You can interrupt, you can redirect, you can do whatever you want with this 10 minutes. Luigi, you can only answer questions. Pinesap, whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Yeah. So my first question would be when, Luigi refers to this idea of oneness, right? When Patriarch John II of Constantinople writes back to Hormisdas, I would like to ask him what he thinks of the following letter that Pope St. Hormisdas sent to Patriarch John II when he wrote him, quote, "As I consider the writings of your love, in which you profess to have one faith with that of the blessed apostle Peter, it seems permissible to exclaim in those prophetic words, behold, how good and how pleasant is it for brothers to dwell together in unity. For neither does it seem how great a distance divides us, when by God's handiwork we are joined in one common dwelling of faith. For now, the divine mercy has procured that once scattered members of Christ have come back together in the completeness of one body."
So by the way, the rest of the debate is going to be cross-exam and open dialogue. So this is where it gets fun.
"And the inheritance of our Lord announced by the prophetic voices, having been laid waste by thieves, is now restored." Pay attention to this next line. "And truly, in the faith of this rock, that is, the firmness of the Prince of the Apostles, the Eastern Church's foundations are made solid. Since your letters have already indicated that this has been done, it must be said with timely rejoicing, how beautiful are the feet of those who announce peace of those who announce good tidings. So my question to Luigi would be, what do you make of that letter when Pope St. Hormisdas seems to explicitly affirm the Catholic view that the oneness that Patriarch John II writes about is oneness in being in communion?
It's very possible that that's what he wanted that to mean. The point is that that's not what neither the legate nor the Patriarch of Constantinople meant when it was signed. Otherwise, the legate wouldn't have apologized to the Pope and wouldn't have said that the Patriarch received it as a letter and not as a libellus.
It seems curious, though, because when the formula of Pope St. Hormisdas is kind of reread repeatedly through church history, it doesn't seem to delete the line that says the solidity of the Catholic faith is, in the apostolic see. How would you respond to that if it was kind of repeatedly?
So he just admitted to the editing of the document, and he's like, oh, but it still keeps these honorifics of Rome in it. Bro, that's not the point. If a pope today releases a decree, a papal decree that is binding, and people don't get to people don't get to edit it and send it back with their edited signature, with their edited document in their signature. That's not how it works. No, you have to accept it. And so he just conceded that there's a different paradigm in the first millennium than there is in the modern Roman Catholic paradigm.
Brought up during different ecumenical councils. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, but different ecumenical councils or what have you.
Oh, that's just, my point with that is just to show that, because I've heard Roman Catholics say before that the term apostolic see, was only used for Rome. So I just wanted to refute that. That was my point with that.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah,
Okay. Let me go to the next question. So it was claimed in your debate review with Dyer that your church could venerate popes who had erred in their view of power, since saints can err, which we would agree as Catholics, right, that saints can make errors. That's perfectly fine. However, this becomes
problematic. Did Dyer say that? Who said that? Sorry,
he did. Oh, no, that's fine. He did during your debate review with VOR, or after the VOR debate. He had said that, I think, about Pope St. Leo, if I'm not mistaken.
That we can venerate popes that fell into error?
No. Saying like their view of ecclesiology you might view as wrong, but it doesn't create any problem for you because in your view,
that there were popes who had like a higher view than what they actually had. Okay, I see what you're saying.
Right. Sorry, I'll continue with the question. However, this becomes problematic when the popes have habitually taught that they had an authority to profess the truth of God to the entire church in a binding manner. If the Holy Spirit protected the early church, then how could the Bishop of Rome repeatedly make erroneous statements regarding his own authority when condemnations about his authority remain unheard of in the church of the first millennium?
So, I guess I would contest. I would need to see what examples you're referring. For example, I can show you Pope Gelasius is a common proof text. I can show you him saying that any bishop can excommunicate anyone, which is contra Roman Catholic canon law. So what specific case study would you be referring to? What pope would you be referring to? And what exactly do you see problematic about venerating them? Because you agree saints make mistakes, right?
Oh, of course. Saints do make mistakes.
Hang on real quick. I'm sorry, Luigi.
Sorry.
You need to be answering, not asking the question.
Oh, yeah.
I just want to that was more of a clarification. Sorry.
Fair. Yeah.
No, that's totally fine. What I would say is the proof texts that I would put forward are like Pope St. Innocent I. I would say Pope St. Agatho. I would say Hormisdas, as I've said earlier, Pope St. Leo, Gelasius, Zosimus, all these popes that seem to assert a power over the entire church.
Well, so Pope Zosimus, that was a local dispute with Carthage. So that doesn't have anything to do with universal authority. We'd have to go down the line with all of these.
Yeah. So literally every single one of these incidents that Pinesap brings up and all of my responses are all found in Craig's book. So that book that I recommended earlier, Rise and Fall of the Papacy by Craig Trulia, you can literally just get the electronic version and Control F, like Zosimus, or Control F Hormisdas, and it'll go line by line through all of it. And he just demonstrates how much the Roman Catholics lie about these issues. Most of the time when they say it's something that is pro-papacy apologetics, it's actually the opposite, like we saw in the case of Hormisdas. And then in the case of Zosimus, it being a local dispute, look, a pope does have authority over his local see, and he has immediate authority over his local patriarchate. That's true for every patriarch. That's true in the modern day with our patriarchs in our ecclesiology in the Orthodox Church. So there's nothing about an event like that would prove some sort of papal supremacy.
Pope Leo says I can show you quotes of Leo talking about the absolute necessity for consent. I mean, all of these popes, they might make some of these claims that sound very honorific and strong, kind of like my honorifics, but ultimately, almost every single one of the ones you listed, still holds to a view of absolute necessity for consent, which is polar opposite what Gasser says in Vatican I.
If the Greek fathers of Nicaea II felt it necessary to leave in the statement of the permanency of Rome's primacy in Adrian I's letter to St. Tarcisius, and this is remarked in Craig Trulia's book in a footnote, and this permanence is repeated in the Acts of Councils like Ephesus with Philip the Papal Legate, what does this mean for the Eastern Orthodox position of such a primacy when their own saints habitually refer to it?
Well, a couple things. First of all, we have Constantinople is New Rome, but I would also say that the language of a see never failing, again, I showed that's why that one quote from the Eighth Ecumenical Council, the Roman Catholic Eighth Ecumenical Council, is so important, because it says all five patriarchs. And then there's the quote of the emperor never failing. So I think that the fathers didn't foresee something like the Great Schism ever happening. And so they just were saying none of these sees are ever going to fail. The emperor's never going to fail. I think that's a better explanation than special pleading and saying only these ones about the Pope are literal, but these other ones are just empty honorifics.
Gotcha. Zen, how much more time do I have?
You have a little under 4 minutes.
Okay, that's totally fine. Luigi, what do you think of the Synod of Whitby, which cited Matthew 16:18 as the precedent for celebrating Easter the way Rome had, over and above the calculation used by St. Columba?
Was this during the what controversy was this? What time period are we talking about?
This would have I think this would have been during the 600s, if I'm not mistaken.
And it quotes Matthew 16.
Yes.
To say what?
To celebrate Easter according to the custom of Rome, over and above that which was.
If this was truly in the 600s, Nicaea I already addressed this at an ecumenical level. So I don't even know why you would need another synod. And if it would be another synod, then it's just reinforcing what was decided at Nicaea I.
According to the custom, meaning the calculation of the date over and above St. Columba's calculation.
I mean, it's pretty clear from Eusebius's recollection of when this was actually established that it was all by virtue of a synod. And this sounds like a local council in the West, or what is this council that you're referencing?
It would be a local council in the West.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so this is actually really interesting. There are so many local councils in the West, which you don't really see in the East, which is why you guys have a much different view on canon law than we do in the East. So you're going to find, I can show you all kinds of councils in the West, local councils that say stuff you don't agree with. One being Carthage, so I would say that even if I were to grant that local council doesn't carry a lot of weight.
Zen, how much time do I have?
About 2.5 minutes.
Okay. One of my
if we held to every local synod, we would all be heretics, because there was plenty of local councils. There was local councils in 359 that had 300 bishops that were Arian. So if that's what we're going by is local synods, we're all cooked. So we have to go based off local synods only if they are accepted at an ecumenical level. Otherwise, they're only really binding on that patriarchate if they haven't been condemned by the church.
Final questions would be, all the evidence I presented to you, that I presented to you, you say is empty honorifics.
Thanks for the memberships. Thank you for the super chats, you guys. I'm going to go over the super chats at the end. I have a couple right now. And then the memberships are huge because those are monthly supports. You guys can also gift memberships to other people. So thank you for those. And then also please like and subscribe, especially to those that are watching after the stream, as a lot of my streams have been hitting the algorithm. So thank you for that. Glory to God.
So what do I need to present or read from the fathers and the councils to prove the papacy?
No, I'm not saying it's empty honorifics. I mean, as I laid out in my initial debate, with Voice of Reason, like we have a high view of like what Rome, like the role Rome had in the first millennium. And I'll read a quote in my closing statement. And what we see from documents like Dictatus Papae is it's very evident that like that model from the first millennium was strayed very, very quickly, like after 1054. And, you know, even something as simple as like the pseudo-Isidorian forgeries, which were extremely influential in the centuries leading up to the schism.
I want to show you guys Dictatus Papae. Dictatus Papae is insane. The stuff that's in here. So, where does it say here? Yeah, right here. This is crazy. So the Roman pontiff, if he has been canonically ordained, is undoubtedly made a saint. It literally says that if you are a valid pope, you are automatically a saint. So look at the date right here. This was a papal decree like right after the schism. And we're seeing them fall into just absolute insane levels of pride right here. So you guys can read like the rest of this stuff. Like there's stuff in here like, yeah, all princes shall kiss the feet of the Pope alone. His name alone shall be spoken in churches. This is the only name in the world. Like this is an insane document. Like I'll put this in the chat for you guys to take a look here for those of you that are unfamiliar. But it's like it just shows just how absolutely insane the papacy went following the Great Schism.
So to be honest, it would be you'd be pretty hard pressed to find evidence because there's so many other honorifics, and because we have such blatant evidence of immediately after the schism of Rome clearly straying from the first millennium tradition. It'd be very hard to prove that.
And like I pointed out too, a better example than honorifics don't really prove anything. Like lofty language doesn't really prove much. What would prove it is like things actually in practice. So when we see the bishops telling Rome to piss off in their decision of who is the bishop of Antioch at Constantinople I, and we see them having low regard for the necessity of Rome at Constantinople I. And we see Emperor St. Theodosius releasing a universally binding decree following the council. We see the Meletian Schism in that same event where communion with Rome is not seen as significant. We see popes being excommunicated in the Second Council of Constantinople. We see popes being anathematized as heretics, like in the case of Honorius at Constantinople III. We see popes deposed, like in the case of Constantinople 867 with St. Photius. So these are examples of real-life events. The Formula Formistas, again, being forced to edit the document. These are real. This isn't honorifics. This isn't lofty language. This is literally real life ecclesiology. Pope St. Martin saying he doesn't have the authority to appoint a patriarch in Jerusalem unilaterally. That he needs a council for that. These are things that are real life examples, not honorifics, not empty lofty language. He's asking me, what's some lofty language that would prove the paradigm? Dude, it's not the lofty language that we need to prove the paradigm. To prove the paradigm, you would need to demonstrate actual real-life examples of unilateral authority superseding the consent of the church. That's what you would have to demonstrate.
The Vatican I papacy. I think it's which is why you have a lot of apologetics now that talk about like the development and how it was a seed form and, grew into fruition.
And so what time am I at?
About 1 minute.
I'll give the time over to Luigi. We can pass on to Luigi's questions.
Okay, no problem. All right, and Luigi, whenever you're ready, you have 10 minutes on the clock for your cross exam.
Just 1 second.
Got it.
This is a slaughter. You guys are about to witness a slaughter. Just heads up.
Okay, I'm ready. All right. So, Pinesap, you brought up the 3 chapters. So the letter to Maurice has nothing to do with the 3 chapters. So Vigilius specifically defends the letter to Maurice. And I read the quotes. I can read them again. He defends the contents. He says this is page 201 of Price. For it is right for us to understand correctly that in this way a document that our fathers accepted, page 199, from the reading of the text of the letter produced by his adversary, his writing has been shown to be Catholic. So he defends the contents of this letter, which he then retracts in the second constitutum. So that is a matter of faith and morals. That's not a matter of fact.
I think what I would say on that is, considering how, the initial controversy with Vigilius, right, was seen as a problem of sort of renouncing Chalcedon. I mean, that's why you have like the schism at Aquila. You have like the schism with like the African churches and stuff like that. They had thought that the Second Council of Constantinople was like renouncing Chalcedon, right?
Oh, I agree. No, I agree. I mentioned this. He's under the impression that Chalcedon accepted Ibas's letter to Maurice. He corrects this in his second constitutum, but the problem is he attempts to bind the church to this letter under that erroneous presupposition. So that is a matter of faith and morals that he attempts to bind the church to.
Is the binding that you're speaking of when he says like anyone who does not accept this is excommunicated?
Well, there's that, and then there's the quote that I read. He also says that. He says, if you don't accept this, you're excommunicated from the Apostolic See. That's on page 171. But I read where he says, by the authority of the Apostolic See, let no one call this into question, basically.
I would have to reread the Father Price's section on that. I have it up here, but it's not really in a condensable format for me to read out quick. But
Okay.
what I would say, I mean, specifically referring to the condemnation or the like excommunication of disciplinary decrees, we have many examples in church history post-schism where someone was like wrongfully excommunicated, or there was a disciplinary measure in terms of an excommunication that didn't necessarily imply any sort of papal infallibility. In fact, one that I can remember off the top of my head actually happened under Blessed Pius IX, in which there was actually a Brazilian bishop who was an extremely holy man of God. I believe he's a blessed or a saint in the church. And he was wrongfully excommunicated because he was dealing with a political issue in Brazil. I think in a contention with Freemasons. So an excommunication or a disciplinary decree in that way can be undone.
I'm not talking about the excommunication, though. That, like, I don't mean to be disrespectful. I feel like this is a little bit of a filibuster because I'm not talking about the excommunication. I'm talking about Vigilius asserting his authority as the Apostolic See and attempting to bind the church to a letter that he later deemed to be heretical. That's what I'm talking about. That's faith and morals. That's not facts.
That I would have to read a little bit more on specifically. So I'd like to pass on to a next question. I'm sure there's a sufficient answer to it. I just don't have it easily accessible in my notes here.
Bro, I mean, that's conceding the debate. Like, this is literally a falsifier of your entire paradigm. And he goes, can we just skip the question? Same guy who said that I'm going to be humbled before the debate, by the way. Come on, dude. I'm sure there's an answer for it. I just don't know it. Okay, dude. I have all the receipts. This was faith and morals. I'll attach my argument here so that you guys can see. I have it all written down on Twitter, so you guys can read it yourself. The argument is very clear. I have never heard a response to this. I've never heard a response to this day. This was over a year ago. I don't know what the response is to this argument.
I'm assuming you agree with the Catholic Catechism when it says that the Pope has universal power over the whole church, a power which he can always exercise unhindered.
Yes.
Okay, so you agree that the Pope can appoint a patriarch, right?
I do.
Okay. Can you explain to me why Pope Martin then says, he, Stephen of Dora, was ordered to ordain bishops and priests and deacons according to the canons, as far as power was lacking to us to appoint the Patriarch of Jerusalem.
So there's two things to there. Keep going.
Go ahead.
So there's two things to keep in mind in the context in which he's writing. For one, that's when Muslim incursions were starting to happen in that region of the world. And so there was a physical difficulty in having the power to elect a new patriarch. On top of that, too, the normative means of electing a patriarch was through a synod, right? Because at the time, they wanted someone who could represent that region of the church. And so they didn't have, really, because of the Muslim incursion and the horrible events going on at that time, the power to gather a synod, which was generally the normative means of electing the new patriarch, in order to appoint that patriarch.
Okay, so two things. So first of all, Stephen of Dora was physically there in Palestine the same year. So it wasn't a matter of him not being able to get there. He was able to get there the same year.
No. I didn't say that he was not able to get there. Well, I know he was there.
And then in the 1200s, the Pope had no problem appointing a patriarch of Alexandria without a council. So do you think a council is required to appoint a patriarch?
No. What I'm saying about
then why are you using that as a justification?
What I'm saying about the synod. Hold on. What I'm saying about the synod is respecting a church's local custom is different than not having the power to do something. I'm saying that Pope St. Martin respected the local custom of using a synod to appoint a bishop, which was actually very prominent in the East as well, or the West as well.
But he specifically uses the verbiage, the power was lacking to appoint the patriarch. He doesn't say he's respecting the traditions. He says the power was lacking to appoint the patriarch.
But given the context, the power might refer to the human, or is likely referring to the human event going on that prevents the normative means of how they would appoint that patriarch, which again, the custom that Pope St. Martin respects.
If the Pope can do it without a council, what are the normative means? He should just be able to appoint the patriarch. This is clear evidence.
And he was able to do it with bishops. So he was able to go there just a couple months ago and appoint bishops, but he can't do it for the patriarch. And he's saying, this was some sort of human factor. No, dude. They were able to do it in the same exact timeline for bishops, but for some reason, they can't do it for the patriarch. Why? Because the Pope in this era recognized he didn't have that authority. He says that explicitly. You can't get clearer language than that.
There's clear evidence that the ecclesiology was different in the first millennium.
Normative means refers to the idea that they want a patriarch who can represent the people, right? This is why you had synods that would elect a patriarch, right? Because they didn't want to necessarily just appoint someone who the people felt at variance with or whatever in order to create discord.
But that's not what he says.
This is what I'm referring to with the church being both divine and human, right? You work with human means to try and appoint the best possible situation. Power doesn't necessarily mean that he was lacking to do so.
But I mean, that's what he says verbatim. I'll let the audience decide. Do you must be in communion with Rome to be a Catholic church?
Say that one more time.
Do you have to be in communion with Rome to be a Catholic church?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Do you agree that the entire church was in communion with Flavian from 394 to 399, except for Rome?
So let me go to my section on the Meletian Schism. So there's kind of a couple.
Specifically, I just want to, before you put that up, I want to point out, I'm talking about Flavian, not Meletius. I'm talking about Flavian from the years of 394 to 399, when the entire church was in communion with him and Rome was not. And then Theodoret says the Western bishops promised to finally bring their hostility to a close in 399. That's what I'm talking about.
Having a certain hostility, right, with the Meletian Schism and what have you, that had kind of led to the events with Flavian, doesn't necessarily mean that he was a full avowed schismatic, right? Having just a mere disciplinary problem doesn't mean that a person is not a part of the Catholic Church. Like I said, you can point to local bishops, right, excommunicating a saint. I'm trying to think of the Australian saint, for instance, who she was excommunicated by her local bishop, but it was a wrongful excommunication. So having a sort of lapse in the situation of a given figure in the church, especially with how letters would travel at that time, doesn't necessarily mean that they were condemned by Rome or fully excommunicated from the Catholic Church.
Well, I'm not saying they were condemned by Rome, but they were not in communion with Rome, because in 394, a conciliar decree of Constantinople had the signatures of all the other patriarchs that Flavian was the true patriarch of Antioch, not Rome's. Rome finally enters into communion in 399. So for 5 years, he was not in communion. He was in communion with the entire rest of the church, but not Rome.
But again, that issue is just a matter of, letters traveling. It doesn't necessarily mean, what I'm saying is that he was not necessarily thrown out of the Church of God just because the letters had to travel or what have you. It's kind of like if you were reconciled with your local bishop and then, letters were sent out to Rome that you were all good and you were no longer in schism or what have you. If Hans Kung, for instance, rather than dying in heresy, had actually reconcile with the German bishops conference or whatever bishops conference he was under, and letters were then sent to Rome, like let's say a month later, a year later, saying, "Hey, he's been reconciled," right?
Okay, I have another question here. So,
Yeah.
do you argue that does Rome get its supreme?
This is really important argument I'm about to make here. And I don't get a chance to respond to his response, so I will be responding to his response. This is really important. This is very important understanding that every bishop is Peter. So pay attention to the argument I've never heard anyone else argue what I'm about to argue. So please pay attention to this.
Good, and you were no longer in schism or what have you. Like if Hans Kung, for instance, rather than dying in heresy, had actually reconciled with the German bishops conference or whatever bishops conference he was under, and letters were then sent to Rome, like let's say a month later, or a year later, saying, "Hey, he's been reconciled," right?
Okay, I have another question here. So, do you argue that does Rome get its supreme authority over the church from Peter because it's Petrine?
Say that one more time.
Does Rome get its supreme authority over the universal church because it's Petrine?
Yes.
Okay. Can you give me a justification for why Antioch is never considered the second see in any canons?
Well, it's not considered the second see because Constantinople was seen as the new Rome, right? It was seen as the
It's not even considered the third. It's not even considered the third see. Alexandria, Antioch is universally considered more Petrine than Alexandria. This is the patristic consensus. So we should expect that if Rome's supremacy comes from being Petrine, that Antioch should always be considered to be right below Rome.
The apostolic see, though, was set, or apostolic see singular, not plural here, because it can be used for many sees, was set up at Rome in order to preside over the other churches. So it's not a mere matter of Peter established the church here, right? But it's, did Peter establish the church in a manner that it was meant to preside over the others? And that's what we see with Rome, right? So that's why Alexandria is Petrine, because, St. Mark the Evangelist helped set it up with sending out from Peter, and Antioch, of course, Peter had spent many years there and helped establish the church there. But Rome is given this specific jurisdiction or privilege over the entire Church of God because Peter meant to instill that church specifically with that Petrine principle.
And that'll be time for the cross-examination.
Okay,
gotcha. So he doesn't actually address the substance of my argument. My argument is that if the reason why Rome is supreme is because they are Petrine, why is Constantinople ranked above Antioch and Alexandria? He didn't answer that. The only justification for why that could be the case is because every bishop is Petrine in the sense that every bishop is Peter. That's the only explanation. So Antioch and Alexandria are subordinate to Constantinople as New Rome, as granted canonically by Constantinople I, because every bishop is Peter. So even though Antioch receives direct Petrine authority, like St. John Chrysostom says, because every bishop is Peter, Constantinople outranks Antioch and Alexandria. Therefore, Rome's authority cannot be supreme just because it's directly received from Peter. There must be some other authority, which is the canonical authority of the church, that's granting them the authority to be the first see. That's what it has to be. That's the only consistent view.
Gentlemen, we are going to go into an open dialogue segment. Before we do that, I want to remind the chat, if you guys want to call in and ask a question.
We're not going to do the call-ins. We are going to do the open dialogue for the next 30 minutes. And also, if you guys could like and subscribe to the live, and then I will be going over super chats at the end of the stream.
Directly to either debater. After the closing statements, you can get a link from the mods in the Discord. The Discord link should be in the live chat somewhere. Go in there, get a stream link from the mods in the Discord. You can call in and ask a question directly to either debater on stream. But we are going to get into an open dialogue segment, so it's similar to what the channel has.
Open dialogue is a fun time. We go over a lot of the objections, so you guys are hear my answers to a lot of the common objections.
traditionally done here. So we'll just have open dialogue, about 30 minutes back and forth. You're each welcome to take the conversation, frame it wherever you want, but be charitable, be respectful to each other. I'll only step in if it's just so much over talking that we can't understand either of you, or if it just trails off somewhere irrelevant. But gentlemen, whenever you're ready, the floor is open.
I want to clarify something. So you said in your rebuttal that I was trying to make the argument that Constantinople I had didn't have the consent of Rome.
Actually, before I dive into this, I really want to walk through sort of my argument that I was making about Vigilius. So this is effectively the argument between these two posts here. So this is Constantinople II. Vigilius states, "We ordain and decree," this is the Pope decreeing over an ecumenical council, "we ordain and decree that it be permitted to no one to write or bring forth anything contradictory to the contents of this constitutum, or after this declaration begin a new controversy about them. And if anything has already been done in contradiction to this our ordinance, this we declare void by the authority of the Apostolic See." So he appeals to the authority of Rome. He says no one can question this after this point. So he's saying, he's literally saying, look, this is my authority as the Pope to make this decree, and I'm appealing to the Apostolic See. Now, in this constitution that he just binded the church to, this, he says about the heretical letter. From the reading of this text of the letter produced by his adversary, his writing has been shown to be Catholic. That's what he says in the letter. That is a matter of faith and morals that he just tried to bind. This is more extensive here that you can also read. Then in his second constitution, after the council, 2 years after, when he submits to the council, he annuls it 2 years later. So this meets all the criteria of an ex cathedra statement right here. All of it. But 2 years later, he's annulling it. So that means that he erred, and he blames Satan for erring, by the way. So that means he erred by trying to bind the entire church. He erred on a matter of faith and morals, and then he annuls it 2 years later. He submits to the council 2 years later. So that's the argument. Pretty simple, pretty irrefutable, and I have yet to hear a sufficient response to this argument.
Rome or something like that. That's not what I was saying. They did have a papal legate, and I brought that up. St. Scholius of Thessalonica was considered the papal legate. My point was that a universal decree was made that was binding upon the whole church, and the Pope had very little to do with it. Whereas that would be unheard of in like a second millennium ecclesiology. That was the point I was trying to make.
Okay, there might have been some miscommunication there. I don't remember exactly. I'm now just forgetting what you literally just said. I apologize. I'm trying to keep.
I'm just talking about the Theodosian. I'm just talking about the Theodosian code.
Again, same guy. I almost want to just like replay at least the beginning of this video. This is the same guy who was this cocky before the debate.
The Crucible next month. Yeah, I'm gonna debate Luigi. That guy needs to be humbled, to be quite honest. I mean, he's literally got his butt beat by both RZ and Voice of Reason at this point, so this guy must be a sucker for punishment. But like, I'm not pulling any punches with this homie. He thinks it's cool to talk shit on the timeline about the.
Not pulling any punches with this homie. He's lucky I was so charitable in this debate.
Right.
And how you had said in your rebuttal, you were like, oh, he's trying to argue that it was binding upon the whole church without Rome. I wasn't saying that. I was saying that there was a papal legate, but it was very little involvement compared to what you would expect from a supreme, immediate, head of the church. That's what I was.
Gotcha. I can get into that in my closing statement. Thank you for clarifying, though. I think there was just some miscommunication there.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you not agree that like a universally binding decree that had little papal involvement, is that not like unheard of in the second millennium? Like, is that something you'd ever dream of happening today in the Roman Catholic Church?
No, well, the thing about Constantinople I is it's as I stated before, right, in the kind of ex cathedra and via ecumenical councils opening that I had. With ecumenical councils, the Pope can approve of a council after the fact, right? And, Constantinople...
No, I agree with that.
Right.
Yeah.
And so...
That's reception theory. Bro, he literally critiques reception theory, and he just conceded to it. He said a pope after a council can accept the council. That's literally reception theory. Reception theory, papacy edition. Like, bro, why are you critiquing it? You're critiquing the epistemology of our reception theory when it's literally the same for you.
So with that, I mean, that's why, for instance, even with Vigilius, in the case of Vigilius, they sought specifically after Vigilius's confirmation the most. Because if you look at like Justinian, right, he had no problem like, exiting this bishop or that patriarch that disagreed with him on the Second Council of Constantinople. And he very much could have done the same with Rome. Now, I know you probably will remark there, oh, he excommunicated him, but that didn't make it into the final acts. And it certainly wasn't a conciliar action, considering how the Council Fathers still insisted that they did not break communion with Rome specifically, even though they intended, per the urgings of Justinian, to excommunicate Pope Vigilius. But of course, that didn't make it in the final session. That was confirmed by Vigilius. And then when he confirmed the council, he issued the council in his own name. And you can see John the Miaphysite actually complain about that. But Price's commentary.
But their verbiage there was in reference to the Roman Synod, right? And not the person of the Pope, which is really significant because we see in Constantinople 869 when 1,000 bishops, including the Roman Synod, depose Pope Nicholas, right? And so we see there's something about the Roman Synod itself and not the person of the Pope.
Yeah, so Craig goes over this in his book, but yeah, Constantinople 867, literally 1,000 bishops get together and depose Pope Nicholas. Like, how is that even possibly compatible with the modern Roman Catholic paradigm?
That was seen as special to the church. Like, do you disagree with that?
I would contest your characterization of the Roman Synod, because the words there is apostolic see. It's not just Roman Synod, right? So they were able to make this distinction between the seat holder and the see.
But they're
you don't
clearly
really
not
see that in breaking of communion with like other apostolic sees that can just be like, broken with communion for X amount of years and then, eventually
but they're clearly not
with
referring to the person of the Pope because they just called him not a Christian. So they have to be called. They must be referring to something other than the person of the Pope when they're saying apostolic see. Otherwise, they wouldn't be saying.
Yeah. So this is a very important point I'm making here. So basically, he's arguing that, hey, they're trying to remain in communion with Rome at Constantinople too, which is true. Except they literally said that the Pope's name is not to be counted amongst Christians. So they're not talking about the person of the Pope when they say they want to remain in communion with Rome. They're talking about the Roman Synod. So in other words, they didn't have this Vatican I understanding of the Pope, the dude. Rather, they had reverence for the Roman Synod, the Roman Patriarchate itself.
Immediately right after that, his name is foreign to that of Christians.
Yes, the seat of Rome. That's what I'm saying. Right? They still saw it as necessary, preserving the communion with the seat of Rome. And again, you don't really see that with other apostolic sees. I mean, other apostolic sees, right? They can, break communion with them, and it's not seen as a necessary constitutive part of the church. I mean, this is what we see, for instance, with like the Pentarchy, right? Like Saint Stephen the Younger, Saint Nicephorus, and Saint Theodore the Studite think that the Pentarchy is completely important, right? But in that, they still have a monarchical view of specifically the Roman See, which they, contest. Can't, without Rome, it can't confirm any of sort of the conciliar actions even taken upon by the other four patriarchs. I mean, Saint Nicephorus is completely explicit about this.
I'm gonna just move on.
Yeah, that's totally fine.
You can jump in at any point too. We're doing open dialogue right now.
It's just open dialogue right now.
Oh,
you guys can.
Right,
so Pinesap, you
totally
can
misheard.
take the conversation wherever you want. You can ask whatever questions you want to Luigi. there's not really a restriction on this, so you guys can go wherever you want with it.
Yeah, so I did actually have a question for Luigi that was very interesting. Was the quote that you were referring to with the Eighth Ecumenical Council that of Banes?
Let me pull up my citation for that.
Where it was like, referring to the Pentarchy and stuff like that?
The five C's.
Yeah. Is that from him?
It is. You can make your point, and I'll tell you when I pull up I got 7 million words here. So
the very interesting thing about him is he says that during the Eighth Ecumenical Council, but he's there during all the sessions which kind of approve the letters of the Pope talking about this perpetuity of specifically the Roman See, right? So even when he's making sort of this statement that's kind of like the absolute equality of the entire Pentarchy, it's very interesting how when we...
That's not my point of the quote. I'm not talking about the absolute equality. I'm saying that the quote states that none of the patriarchs that all 5 patriarchs will never totally fall away. That's what it says. So these quotes about the Pope that say, the Pope will never fall away, and they primarily cite the letter of Pope Agatho, which is accepted at the very same council where they condemn a Pope for falling away, for falling into heresy. All my point is that, look, their own ecumenical council at 869 is saying the same thing about the 5 patriarchs. So him bringing up, this council affirms the supremacy of Rome, or the preeminence of Rome, whatever. That's not relevant to my point. My point, it's not a council we accept. My point is merely that the council states the same thing about all the patriarchs that they like to cite about Rome and how they will not fall away, and it cites Matthew 16 to justify it. That's my point.
Listen to the retelling of the Acts by Price. We don't see him contesting when Rome is given a specific sort of prerogative of perpetuity that's, as I kind of said earlier in the debate, referenced by, say, Philip the Papal Legate, Pope St. Leo, and, Pope Hadrian, I think it was Pope Hadrian the First at Nicaea too, right? In his letter to St. Tarsicius, which Craig, again, leaves in his book, but then he just kind of writes it off as like honorific words.
Well, so first of all, this council had 12 bishops. When 2 years prior, they were able to get 1,000 bishops to depose the Pope. But also this council...
That's insane, but 12 bishops. So this is the Roman Catholic 8th Ecumenical Council. They consider this an ecumenical council. It had 12 bishops in attendance. 12. This is their canonical 8th Ecumenical Council. Constantinople 869. 12 bishops showed up. 12. When 2 years prior, 1,000 got together and deposed the Pope. Does that sound remotely compatible with modern Roman Catholicism? Imagine if that happened today. 1,000 cardinals and bishops get together and they depose the Pope, which already sounds insane. And then 2 years later, the Pope calls a council and only 12 people show up. Imagine that happening in the modern paradigm. Sounds ridiculous, right? Well, that's because the modern Roman Catholic paradigm is so foreign to the first millennium church.
Canon 1, and I can read the whole canon, but the canon states that when a determination is made by Constantinople, that's final in the East. And that when a determination is made by Rome, that's final in the West. And that both sees are to basically respect those decisions. That is not something that is compatible with, you guys don't even have a see that's even remotely close to having that type of authority in the current modern Roman Catholic Church, where they would have a matching authority to Rome's.
But what I would contest about that is when we see in the Council 879, which we would refer to as the Photian Council, we actually see it brought up during the Council Acts that it's primarily the Pope's prerogative to bind and loose, and that's why he could bind and loose the prior anathemas and what have you against Photius. It's given that specific Petrine principle to the Pope to bind and loose the prior council that had happened in the anathemas or the deposition of Photius, right? And in a specific prerogative referred to as the prerogative that Rome holds. In fact, that's kind of why the Gregorian reformers brought up actually the Council of 879, specifically the Photian Council, so much during the Gregorian reform as a precedent for St. Gregory VII's binding and loosing authority, because they saw it as a strong affirmation of the Petrine principle.
Well, I would need to hear the actual quotation, because what I find interesting is, first of all, St. Photius is called all kinds of honorific stuff at that council. He's called
of course he is, yeah.
He's called the most holy master and ecumenical patriarch, one true shepherd. But this is really interesting, especially on the topic of what you just said, because Pope Gregory II, when he's writing to the Emperor Leo III, he says that both Constantinople and Rome have received power from above to loose and to bind things in heaven and on earth. And so what we see during this controversy is actually like that both Constantinople and Rome have that authority. And I would argue that St. Photius was never rightfully deposed because it never had the consent of the church. So we don't need the Pope to determine that. And do you guys accept that that St. Photius was the rightful patriarch?
We don't accept that he was the rightful patriarch when St. Ignatius was deposed, but once that whole controversy had blown over, he then did become the rightful patriarch.
So you would say
that doesn't make any sense, because oftentimes what we like to hear about Constantinople 879 is that they're merely just accepting the all of the claims that are made about St. Photius, which is all, and it's all about how he was wrongfully deposed. So how can that be the case, what he just said? That doesn't even make any sense.
he was the patriarch, and then he wasn't for 10 years, and then he went back to becoming the rightful patriarch.
Well, remember, St. Ignatius writes an appeal to Rome to settle the issue with Photius, right? Because that's one of his whole things. He's like, I've been unjustly deposed, right? Photius has taken my seat, and so now you need to hold this council in order to deal with the whole issue regarding Photius, right? And that's where you get the council of, I believe, 869, if I'm not mistaken. Then after that, kind of the issue is quelled. There's communion reestablished between Photius and Rome, right? Under, I believe, John VIII, if I'm not mistaken. And at that point, Photius is accepted as the Patriarch of Constantinople by the West.
I'm just curious, what is your response to Constantinople 867, where over 1,000 bishops deposed the Pope? The Pope ends up dying, so he never gets word, but it had the full consent of every patriarch, including the Roman Synod, to depose Pope Nicholas.
I would have to see the evidence for that and read upon that specific instance, admittedly more.
Okay.
What I would say...
Another question he doesn't have an answer to. So another question that refutes his paradigm, and by the way, Craig goes over all of the receipts for 867 in his book. Another question that he basically just concedes. So that's 2 times throughout this debate that he's effectively just conceded.
Is that not every deposition or what have you is automatically valid just because a lot of bishops attend it. For instance, now you might contest because this wasn't attended by a bunch of patriarchs, but in fact, ironically, when the Council of Florence was going on, it's always referred to as Basil Ferrara Florence for a distinct reason, because the Council of Basil met together, right, and started issuing sort of like conciliarist sounding decrees. And so when Pope Eugene IV had kind of a problem with that, he said, okay, I shut down this council and I'm moving it to Florence instead, to which the council fathers at that time said, okay, well, we say you're deposed and we oppose this, or we prop up this anti-pope. So just because there's maybe a synod or a council that says the Pope is deposed, I don't necessarily automatically think that that is a deposition that is valid, right? And again, I would go back to our monarchical view that I think is in line with the early church.
And the only justification he has for that is to presuppose his own paradigm that the Pope can't be deposed. So even though he's canonically properly deposed with universal consent in 867, because the Pope can never be deposed, therefore the deposition was false. That's basically his response.
Fathers of the Pentarchy, which St. Robert Bellarmine, in his work on the councils, says that the Pentarchy does belong to the health of the church, but given that, again, like Ephesus II and Ephesus I didn't have the consent of all the patriarchs of Christendom, it's not a necessary constituent for whether a council is validly ecumenical or not.
Okay, I want to respond to that in a second. First of all, the reference is Acts of Constantinople 869, page 87 is where he
87.
says, it's where he says 1,000 signatures were gathered to depose Pope Nicholas, including all the patriarchs. I want to respond to your I didn't get a chance to get to this reception theory. So wouldn't you agree that even though it took time for Hebrews and Revelation to be considered scripture, that the moment it was penned as scripture, it was scripture?
Say that one more time.
So wouldn't you agree that just because it took time for the church to receive Revelation and Hebrews, that they were still scripture the moment they were penned?
Yes, I would.
That's the full concept of reception theory. That just because it wasn't immediately recognized doesn't take away that it was ecumenical.
But I think where we would disagree is where is the epistemological certainty in that? Because, for instance, and this is what Bishop Callistus Ware brings up, I forget in which address to which college, but he talks about in the Orthodox view what is considered an ecumenical council or not, and he refers to all these different like false synods, right, that happen. In fact, one of which I wanted to refer to you because you mentioned the four patriarchs consenting to something. You have like the Synod of Oaks, for instance, that condemned St. John Chrysostom, and the only one person who spoke up for St. John Chrysostom was actually the Bishop of Rome. All four patriarchs were represented at that synod and declared that St. John Chrysostom was condemned. So if all the four patriarchs are there and they condemn him, does that then automatically mean that his condemnation was valid just because most of the pentarchy was represented?
It wasn't received by the whole church, though. It wasn't received by every one of the patriarchs. And I would also just...
So the only context in which you only need all but one patriarch is if they are actually deposing that one patriarch in question. So if they're deposing another bishop, you do need, in this case, in the case of St. John Chrysostom, when they're trying to do a universally binding excommunication, those patriarchs can excommunicate him from their jurisdictions. That's fine. But they can't from the universal church without the universal consent of the church. That's the point. So yeah, there are instances where you would only need 4 out of the 5. And the only instances where you would need 4 out of the 5 is simply where you're deposing that 5th patriarch. So if it's in regards to some other issue, you need the universal consent.
Ask on the epistemic certainty thing. I think you could say the same for example, when Pope Liberius signs an Arian confession, and Jerome says Pope Liberius, conquered by the tedium of exile and subscribing to heretical wickedness, entered Rome. That's Jerome saying that. We all know Jerome has a very high view of the Pope. So I think if you pick out like a given moment in time and you say like, where is the epistemic certainty? That's not going to work well for you, me, or the Protestant. So we have to look at like the paradigm as a whole, because you're going to be in the same position during this period of time, or even like during the time of Vigilius before he wrote his second Constitutum. So I would just say that you don't really offer a solution to that.
Well, what I would say to kind of contest that is, when you have a period of time where it's sort of patriarch against patriarch, it's this patriarch doesn't consent to that, these 2 patriarchs don't consent to that council, these 3 do. It sort of demands that every lay person suddenly becomes or is needing to become a theologian because they're not really necessarily able to even trust their local bishop. I mean, you have like councils.
Do you see how he's not responding to what I said? I literally said he has the same problem because when a pope like Liberius signs an Arian confession, everybody that was under Rome has to submit to that. So whether or not he was coerced, of course he was coerced. That's fine. That's not the point. The point is that everybody, the same epistemic problem he's positing against our paradigm is the same problem he has. So he doesn't offer a solution to this. It's a problem that we can grant is a problem. But the papacy does not offer a solution to it.
Again, like false councils like Seleucia or the other Arian synod, that was attended by way more bishops, right, than any sort of ecumenical council.
Welcome to the memberships. Thank you for the memberships. And thank you for the super chats as well. I'm going to be, the discussion here is almost done for the open dialogue, and that's when I'm going to be ending the stream. So, so if you guys will have super chats to send them in. I'll go over them at the end. I have a couple here to go over. And then the memberships are really appreciated because those are monthly support. So I really appreciate those memberships. And like I said, if you are a paid member or you're a subscriber over on Twitter or on Substack, I will send you any of my debate notes that you personally request.
Council that went on. And by all intensive accounts, that would seem like it had a greater reception than even these smaller ecumenical councils that proclaim the true faith. It seems that the only consistent theme that we see in church history, even with the events kind of leading around Vigilius, as I stated earlier, where his approval is still very much sought after, it seems like confirmation by the Bishop of Rome is kind of the only consistent theme. Otherwise, we're kind of ping-ponging and trying to figure out, like, does a council only become ecumenical like 100 years after it's called? I mean, most certainly, I would agree. We don't want to jump to like easy conclusions as Catholics and say like, oh, because we're not given the full.
So this same, first of all, not like setting aside that this also applies to 879 for them, because it took hundreds of years before they post hoc accepted 869 over 879. Setting that aside, my point about the scripture was it can be applied here too. So, and notice how he had no response to that.
Information about, say, Saint Liberius or what have you, that therefore means we can hold like an epistemic principle over and above Orthodox or Protestants. But I'm referring more to, it seems like there's this long platitude of time in the Orthodox view where we're not really sure whether a council is ecumenical or not. Sorry, that was a lot, but
you could say the same thing about Hebrews and Revelation taking so much time to be received. I mean, Rome didn't even consider Revelation to be scripture until Athanasius went to Rome to convince the Pope. So, I mean, you could say the same thing. I would say you guys have reception theory when it comes to recognizing scripture and even recognizing councils, because in the Pope accepted Constantinople 879. It wasn't until the Gregorian Reform that was backtracked and Constantinople 869 was accepted. So that's reception theory right there in your own paradigm.
What I would contest, though, with that is I'm pretty sure Pope John VIII, or the reigning pope at that time, had only accepted that Photius was then made the legitimate patriarch of Constantinople. I wouldn't say that he accepted, because I believe in his letter confirming the council, he puts kind of a qualifier on there, and I'd have to bring it up again, where he talks about how
the qualifier he gives is that if the council departed from the apostolic teaching, from apostolic authority, then he rejects that part of the council. So it's like this, he gives this very like ambiguous like qualifier to basically save himself from a controversy, from stamping his flag on a controversy. But that's not how that works. If the legates accept the synod, which they did, he needs to say what specifically he's rejecting. Just like our patriarchs did with Florence, where we held a synod and we anathematized the council. That's not what you see from John VIII after 879. You see an ambiguous, if the legates accepted anything non-apostolic, then we reject that. Like what specifically? You have to give specifics of what you're rejecting. That's how that works. So it's what he's saying here doesn't hold up.
He confirms the fact that Photius is the instated patriarch of Constantinople. So that's what I would say in response to that. Sorry, I'm kind of losing my train of thought because we're going back and forth on kind of a lot of different details.
You want to switch gears? I just kind of want to get your thoughts on these quotes about Jerusalem, like they're like Justin the Emperor, and then more specifically St. Augustine, saying that like the communion with Jerusalem is necessary to be a Catholic church. What are your thoughts on that?
So my thoughts on that are, it would be similar to in the church actually nowadays, that if I was not in communion with my local bishop, I would not be in communion with the Catholic Church. For instance, I'll give you an example. Archbishop Aquila of Denver, right? He's the Archbishop of my region and what have you, has said that when you go to an SSPX chapel, you're not maintaining communion with him, right? Even if they might, have him in the commemoration in the liturgy, right? The East would know this as the diptychs. it's a matter of being united in faith and heart to the local bishop that places you in communion with the church universal. And that's the same way we would view those words about, oh, was that the Patriarch of Jerusalem?
Yes, it was St. Augustine was
Yes.
talking about Jerusalem.
Yes, we would view it the exact same way, right? Because it's not simply that it's just the Pope and then all other bishops are eliminated from there. In fact, are eliminated from the divine hierarchy of the church. In fact, this is completely contested against after Vatican I by not only Blessed Pius IX, but also Leo the 13th. Leo the 13th in like Satis Cognitum says, the bishops of the church are truly bishops. They're not merely just like Peter's servants, or sort of during the controversy with like St. Gregory the Great and John the Faster, like just merely like extensions of the Pope, but not being real bishops within themselves. It's like they're real and truly bishops. And so that would be kind of, and similarly, the German episcopate issued a round letter about how, the Vatican I definition did not do away with the episcopate. And Blessed Pius IX actually writes to them and says, not
This is such everything he's saying is a waffle. None of this has anything to do with the quote I asked him about St. Augustine, saying that when Rome makes a decision about a bishop, St. Augustine says if Rome makes a decision about a bishop to depose or excommunicate them, that bishop can appeal to the plenary council. In other words, it's a higher authority than the Pope. It's a higher authority than Rome. Everything he's saying here is nonsense. None of this has anything to do with that.
only do, I tolerate this definition. This is a perfect enunciation of the council. So we do not eliminate the local church by any means. And so to be in communion with the local hierarch of the church is most certainly a necessary constituent of being in communion with the church universal. So that's why the catechism defines schism as it's not just about being in communion with the Bishop of Rome, but all your other Catholics around you.
So I would just say a couple things. So first of all, we have a pretty well-established patristics that say that there's something unique about Jerusalem because, as the mother of all churches, which Rome claims that title, even though Constantinople I gave that title to Jerusalem. But St. Augustine's justification, right, is this. He says, Christ made there the beginning of the preaching of his name, and you shrink back with horror from having communion with that city. St. Clement even says that the Bishop of Jerusalem is the Bishop of bishops. And then Avitus says that they have a primacy. As I said, Justin, the emperor, says that communion with them is absolutely necessary and no one would dare break communion with them. So it seems to be more than just communion with your local church. But I would also say that everything you just said, I don't see why that can't be applied to the quotes by Jerome that talk about the necessity of communion with Rome. It just seems like special pleading.
I don't think it's special pleading in the slightest because, again, it goes back to what I said about honorifics. Why are honorifics used? Honorifics denote a certain theological conclusion that we reach by, understanding the full context of what's being written. Why is Jerusalem called the mother of all churches? In fact, I believe it was St. John Paul II who, in an ecumenical gathering, addressed the Patriarch of Jerusalem as, being a part of the mother of all church, or the mother of all churches, or hailing from the mother of all churches. And the reason why he says that is because the church, of course, started in Jerusalem. That was, where all the events starting and establishing the church had gone on. But Rome has this motherhood in a sense of being having this jurisdictional power over the entire church, given the context of the early patristic evidence we have. Certainly, Jerusalem can be referred to as a mother and is, even after the schism, in a sense of, again, being where the church had originally started, right? And so as a mother to her sons, all the other sees are established. But Rome is a mother in the sense that she is established to preside over the church universal. So there's a distinction there made.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's kind of begging the question of what the debate is about, because you're saying it's because they have this, jurisdictional universal power over the whole church. Well, that's what we're debating, so I think that's kind of begging the question in order to answer the special pleading.
I don't think necessarily, because again, if I simply just read a letter and it says Father of Fathers or head of the church or what have you, I'm reading that in a manner. If I'm reading how you're reading, I'm just saying, well, if anyone else is called the head, no one can be the head. If anyone's called the key bearer, everyone has to be the key bearer. But there's always these distinctions made, right? I mean, why does St. Leo the First, for instance, in his sermon say that even though like all the apostles have equal honor, Peter in that apostolic college is established as sort of being the preeminent amongst them? And this is backed up by even post-schism saints like St. Bernard of Clairvaux that say there are many doorkeepers, there are many key bearers, but you are the preeminent amongst them in his on consideration to, I think, Pope Eugene III.
Yeah, I mean, so a couple things. First of all, I mean, we agree that Peter was the chief apostle. I mean, nobody disputes that. I think I can point you to multiple quotes by St. Leo that, point to the requirement for consent. He also calls the emperor, he says the emperor can't err. So, I mean, again, I think a lot of these quotes just end up being special pleading. As far as like jurisdictional, stuff, I mean, I actually have two examples here of, one of them is Ambrose, of all saints, who appeals to Constantinople despite being in a Roman jurisdiction. And then the same for the Bishop of Patras. I have two examples of that. And so like, if those are the type of like justifications that you guys give as like why Rome has this like universal immediate authority. But then we see the same thing with Constantinople. We see the same thing with the emperor. If anything, the emperor is the one who ends most of these schisms. Even with the popular formula for mistas, I can show you where the history books say Justin was the one who forced all the bishops to finally sign a version of it.
There's a problem with that there. It's the difference between having material and formal power, right? So the Pope can most certainly, this is, again, goes back to what I said about status cognitum, right? The Pope can bind the church to something, but whether or not it is, completely sort of that binding is carried out would have to be on the part of the emperor because, the Pope wields the spiritual authority over the entire church and the emperor would wield the temporal authority over the entire church. In fact, you should understand this. This is the concept of symphonia in the East, right? The sort of harmony that exists between church and state. Pope St. Leo didn't have, yeah, I mean, you could be one pope, but like these popes didn't necessarily have like an army just at will that they could go issue and say, hey, go talk to this bishop and if he's not going to comply, take him down. They would have to go with the authority at the time that had the ability to do that, right? And that's using the human means to issue a universal binding declaration or act.
But that's not the justification they give. I mean, like I said with Pope Agatho, I mean, he references the emperor as being divinely appointed. He applies Matthew 16 to him. I also would like to point out that Gregory
in the city of Zion verse, in the city of Zion, like acclamation.
Yeah.
Well, what I would say, but remember,
he says
acclamation, he says you take on the invincible strength of the faith, right? And I mean, this is very common with like Ubi Petrus and stuff like that, but you guys also like to bring up the whole suggestio, like kind of line and stuff like that during that council.
I don't want to get too far. I don't want to get too far past I want to read this quote on the topic of material power.
Hold up one moment, because you have been talking quite a bit. I need to get some.
We got about 4 minutes left here, so yeah, Pinesap, go ahead and finish your point. Luigi,
so I mean, this is like Agatho's suggestion.
So in the home stretch here, thank you guys for the memberships. Thank you for the super chats. I'm going to go over the super chats here right at the end. So if you want to get one of those in, and then also when I hit 20 members, that's when I'll start doing members only live streams at the end of every stream. So if you want to be part of that, please sign up for memberships. And like I said, I'll send you all my notes to all my debates if you are a paid member on YouTube, to Twitter, or Substack.
Suggestion to the Sixth Ecumenical Council. He says, but those who do not wish to make this profession of faith with us, we judge them as enemies of the Catholic and Apostolic profession of faith to be liable to eternal condemnation. Nor would we receive them ever in the college of our lowliness unless they have amended, nor should any of them suppose that we have transgressed against what we have received from those who have gone before us. I mean, even Father George Flavorsky, right? I'm probably butchering his last name, I apologize, I'm not great at Greek, but I mean, he even admitted that the document that Pope St. Agatho sends to the Sixth Ecumenical Council, he saw as an infallible document. This is, one of your most august theologians conceding to us that he saw his document as, completely infallible. And what do the council fathers do? They completely accept it.
Well, if it's infallible, then that means that the Orthodox empire of the emperor will never fail, because that's what it says.
No,
So
but
if
what
that's
I've kept
infallible,
saying about that, remember, in that same acclamation, he says, you put on the strength of the invincible faith. So the
I'm just gonna
Orthodox
read it.
empire will never have the gates of hell prevail.
Yeah, he's, again, like I explained earlier, he's conceding our entire paradigm. We agree with that. It's the orthodoxy that the gates of hell will never prevail against. And that's true for the Pope as well. He special pleads out of it for the Pope.
Precisely because they hold the true faith. It's not just because they're the empire alone.
okay,
and likewise, hold on one moment. If you were to use that line to invalidate the infallibility of the Pope, you would also likely have to be, consistent in that and invalidate in that same ecumenical council the indefectibility of the church, because the church is talked about as giving those same divine provinces. Otherwise, you're just doing, as you said earlier, special pleading as to what is truly our doctrine and what is not.
Well, I don't even have to dispute whether or not this is ex cathedra. I think I can actually, ex cathedra can be anyone that's speaking like an Orthodox doctrine. Something that is true is ex cathedra. So even if this letter were to be ex cathedra, that's kind of irrelevant. Because
but how is it irrelevant?
Well, so even like the Cappadocians' writings are called theanostas. I mean, St. Cyril's writings are called similar things. So like when a document is Orthodox, of course it's ex cathedra. Ex cathedra means that it's free from error.
But document, but here's my whole issue. The document that you're calling Orthodox refers specifically to the Apostolic See being indefectible and possessing a certain level of infallibility. And if you don't believe me, like the spiritual mother that's referred to in the document, as you can see when it's talking about, I believe it's Subdeacon Constantine, the Apostolic See, meaning Rome, is referred to as the spiritual mother in their reference to Constantine the subdeacon during that council.
Okay,
so the spiritual mother isn't even the entire church. It's seen primarily as the Apostolic See. So if you're calling that argument, or if you're calling that document Orthodox, that would still be conceding my position, because you would say what Pope St. Agatha wrote on the indefectibility and infallibility of the Apostolic See, Rome, singular in this sense, was Orthodox, and so therefore the Catholic position still wins out.
We have like 30 seconds.
Luigi, go ahead and make your response, your final point on this, and then we'll go to closers.
Yeah, we have to receive the letter as the council received it, and this is the same council that condemns Honorius for a doctrinal error. So it can't be the case that they meant Vatican I indefectibility if in the same council they condemn a pope for teaching error to the church, a doctrinal error, which, by the way, I believe a total of 6 councils, which Eric Ibarra grants, 6 different councils say this, and 3 of which are ecumenical, one of which is Constantinople 869, and it specifically points out the doctrines that Pope Honorius taught to the church. So we have to read these statements about indefectibility in the context of when they were received and how they were received.
All right, that'll do it for the open dialogue.
All right. So that is my debate with Pinesap. I am going to be back. So I'm going to be going over Super Chats here. And thank you guys for tuning in today. So first of all, thank you to Savage here, who says, congrats on the monetization. Take this orb of cash. Appreciate that. I really appreciate the support. I want to offer more streams to you guys. Especially I want to do call-in streams in the evenings, probably Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So I am going to be doing call-in streams as I kind of get more traction over here. And so I appreciate the super chats and the memberships and all of that jazz. And so, yeah, thank you for the support. Keep up the good work, bro, from Maury. Thank you. I appreciate that. Likeitch says, why is the focus on random quotes instead of mutually agreed church law? The creed never says the church is Petrine and canons enforce jurisdictions. I'm not sure if I understand your question. I'm not sure who you're critiquing, if it's me or if it's Pinesap. But the church is Petrine in the sense that every bishop is Peter. And I can show you guys Ubi's article on this that makes this very clear. Nice. Sig gave me a shout out today in my live. Thank you, Sig. So this is an excellent compilation of quotes here that you guys can check out. There's drop the link in the chat for you, and you can go through all the quotes that show that every bishop is a successor of Peter. All right. So this has been episode 5. Like I said, Thursdays are going to be my normal. I'm going to do a React stream on Thursdays. So Tuesdays and Saturdays will be my normal streams where I go over news and topics such as immigration and the JQ and things of that nature. So I'll be back Saturday. I think my plan right now is to go over immigration and the Calgary plan on Saturday at 2 o'clock. You are not going to want to miss that stream. That stream is going to go crazy. My stream from Tuesday has been doing very well. Please go over and check out my stream from Tuesday where I go over St. Seraphim Rose and topics regarding the white race. And also check out my Twitter and my Instagram because I post all kinds of quotes over there on nationalism and on race. So all that being said, please give me a follow on all my platforms at Real Ben Michael, especially on Instagram and Twitter. Of course, like and subscribe to this video. And please sign up for memberships, and I'll start doing once I hit 20, I think I'm at like 8 right now. Once I'm at 20, I will start doing some live streams for members only at the end of every stream. And I will see you guys on Saturday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time.